We're excited to host today key stakeholders in the retail ecosystem, both from the corporate side, the venture side, and the entrepreneurship side. And they will share with us from their experience as well. We're even more excited to see many familiar names and faces in the audience. Some of them are representing leading startups that Deloitte is partnering with in the market as we speak. If you have questions during the event, please make sure to send them to us through Q&A, and we will try to answer as many as we can. We have a packed agenda, but still we'll try to hit a few of them, and if not, we'll make sure to follow up with you afterwards. Last thing, as you heard, the session is being recorded, and we will share the recording with you in a few days after we get it, capture it, and send it to you in a consumable way. Our first talk of the day will focus on different trends in the retail and the effect that COVID-19 had on our universe and the market. I'd like to present and give the stage to Rani Argov, co-leader of Deloitte Digital and the retail sector leader here in Deloitte Israel, to take us through the trends and also the highlights we identify in our report. Rani?
Thank you, Amit. And hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As Amit mentioned, I lead Deloitte Digital in Israel and also the retail sector. So pretty much all of my career is about supporting incumbent retail and consumer product companies in understanding the way technology can implement their business and contribute to their business challenges. And hence the report we are about to talk about is a big part of the way we are continuously connecting global and domestic traditional players and allowing them to understand and enjoy the merits of exciting technologies and ventures. This is the third report we are actually publishing, the third annual report. And it's a pleasure to just witness and take part in the retail community and the innovation ecosystem becoming and reshaping and becoming such a large and a big proportion of the way business is being dealt with. We have a very exciting sessions, and as it so happens, there are speakers who are way more interested than me. So my role is actually quite simple. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have witnessed in the last year or so around the retail and consumer products arena, and I'm going to share, the structure and taxonomy of our report, trying to allow you all to understand what do we identify as the major forces reshaping the industries and these exciting technologies that creates the capabilities that could cope with them. And I'm going to quickly dive into that and leave time to a fantastic panel to elaborate on these. So it's been one heck of a year, right? I mean, every retailer and every consumer products company we talk to describe like massive changes and immense challenges and extreme volatility in their business configuration and the way they need to reshape experiences and interactions in their supply chain. And I think it's important to notice that in many senses, COVID accelerated trends and forces that were here before. So last year in my presentation, by the way, a physical one on a stage and not one by Zoom, I've talked about the way that the physical point of sale's strategic role is being reshaped, and in some cases, it's not even to sell anymore. And we've talked a lot about the way that due to commoditization of product, experience is the major way to differentiate yourselves and to gain consumer loyalty. And we talked about the way supply chains are being streamlined because you need to create that cost leadership possibilities. And then COVID hits us, and some more shapes are being boosted and accelerated. So we'll talk a lot about the remote as a default option to interact with brands and sellers. We'll talk a lot about the importance of convenience and safety as a major business drivers. And I think one of the things that we are witnessing the most is that battle for consumer loyalty. So how do I stand out and really effectively interact with my target audiences and gain, that loyalty and commitment and ongoing relationship? And obviously, a lot of people talk about the incredible boost in e-commerce rates. You can see that on the right-hand side of the slide. During the path between Q1 and Q2 of 2020, e-commerce rose by something that, equivalent to 5 or 10 years of normal growth rate. And I think many focus on that, but I want to look at two other implications, and one of them being, you can see that on the left-hand side of the slide. In many cases, when lockdowns are over, when shops are open, people clearly indicate that they still want that physical experience. They still want, in some categories, groceries, household goods, obviously medicine. They still want to visit a physical facility as part of their journey. So the importance of the physical interaction is still at a very high rate. On the other hand, online marketing and e-commerce, and I'm sure Daniel will talk about that later, is booming, and it's very hard to stand out. So how do you actually stand out in that red sea of online, red ocean of online presence is a challenge, and a lot of technologies try to serve that particular business need. And I want to highlight three cross-industry trends or consumer habits that I find to be interesting, and we have come to encounter them, in retail, but also in financial services, in healthcare, in public service. So these are the three. Obviously, remote. Everything that has a decent possibility to be done remotely, remote education, remote medicine, shopping, service, you name it. If we have that ability to provide a decent experience, people will gravitate towards that. A second habit is people are very interested at hygiene and trust. I'm no longer willing to allow products, brands, and people that I don't trust into my house or my body or my meal. And we see that around, service people visiting the household. We see that around brands that are actually growing due to the fact that they provide trust and clarity. And obviously the economic uncertainty is very present. And while we see the impact on luxury products and on the mixture of purchase, I want to highlight that in many cases, people are actually willing to pay more to gain flexibility. So people are willing to pay $1.99 more if they know that, if they happen to lose their job or, dramatically change their financial situation, they could back down from an agreement, on rent or car or insurance. And many companies actually try to create these new offerings to facilitate, that need for flexibility. And now to our report, which obviously is very business driven. And I think you need to clearly understand that we have indicated three very distinct layers. And the driving one is actually the business trends. We have identified 8 trends that are reshaping industry and experiences and actually force that change. The second layer is the capabilities. Incumbent players, retailers, consumer packaged goods, other sellers need to grow these capabilities to effectively compete in that reshaped arena. And the technology is the enabler. So we have identified hundreds of Israeli-originated startups and ventures that actually allow traditional players these capabilities and hence allow them to effectively manage and adjust to these trends. So around every part of the report, which hopefully some of you have read and others will read later after the discussion, you can see the trend, the capability, and the enabling technologies. And I'm going to start with the trends because to me this is most interesting. And as mentioned, we can identify 8 major trends that are a big part of the change we are witnessing. Commoditization and premiumization of products. While products are harder and harder to distinguish, and the product offering to many clients is becoming pretty similar, experiences and interactions are the way to create relationships and to differentiate yourself. Digital success and cost, I've talked about that. It's very hard to stand out in the online field to do that and to control the way your digital marketing expenses are growing, you need to have the right tools and right capabilities to make sure you get the maximum, bang for your buck. Shops, as mentioned, are becoming smaller and closer, and hence, you need to create and declare what is the strategic role of the physical point of sale. Is it a distribution hub? Is it a place to explore new products and new brands? Is it a place to grow the community of users? And we see a lot of technologies that actually focus around digitizing the physical point of sale, which is a major challenge for retailers. New and exciting business models are becoming a big part. We'll dive to that in a minute. Obviously, convenience and safety, as mentioned, is one of the biggest forces that COVID has brought to the table. So is the health and sustainability. This is part of the trust building and the way that product should be conceived and perceived by our clientele. Consolidation is pretty interesting. We see the major tech marketplaces, the Google, the Facebook, the Instagrams of the world becoming more involved in retail. And not only that, as a retailer, I need to make sure that I'm spreading out my channel strategy. I now have a major opportunity/threat I need to address to make sure that the way I'm being perceived on these platforms is to the point. And last but not least, volatility is key. Retail is a very linear business. It can grow 3 or 4, 6%, or it can decrease. But now it needs to react to major changes, lockdowns, borders being forcing, and all of the changes that actually affect in a non-linear way. To build that volatile supply chain requires, technologies and external provider building that network around your value chain, and that's a big challenge to traditional businesses. So as mentioned, I'll just be like a couple of minutes before we go to the panel. In each of these trends, we'll talk a little bit about, the models or the merits of the trend. We'll share the facts and figures. Direct to consumer is growing. New ways of providing products from click and collect until curbside and so on. And then we'll talk about the capabilities. If you want to effectively manage that trend, you need to integrate very different purchasing channels. You have the technologies that allow you to do that. You need to enable the flexible fulfillment. That's a real challenge. And a lot of the technologies we work with actually allow you not to rely on your own fleet, warehouses, people, but to become that network who can grow rapidly and react when there's shutdown. And obviously new channels and technologies that enables you to effectively access these. So I'm going to fast forward and go to my last slide. There's obviously a lot that has been going on, and it's going to be like that for the upcoming years. We have sort of created that to-do list, right? You need to go beyond the product and build the experiences. You need to stand out online and make sure that you communicate with your target audiences. You need to adapt the stores and access those new business model. Obviously, prioritize convenience and safety because customers are shouting out that as a major decision-making driver for them. Healthier products, leverage the marketplace because it's a big change, and adopt flexibility as part of your core business. I know it's a lot. I think our role in the equation is to understand strategy, pick the focus areas, and allow these exciting technologies and entrepreneurs to take part in that massive change and support our global corporate client in the way to drive that change really fast. Alison.
Excellent. So before Alison, by the way, Ronnie, there is a question in the chat for you, so you can answer that directly through the chat. And thank you again, Ronnie, for this great presentation. And it's clear that the tech ecosystem in Israel is taking a bigger role in the changing retail landscape globally. And of course, here at Deloitte, we're really happy to support that and the startups on their journey. Our second part of the session today is a panel. One of our biggest roles here at Deloitte is to bring together our MNC clients and leading startups. The way we do that is by understanding their business needs and translate them into tech solutions. To hear more on the perspective of multinationals and their interactions with retail techs, I'm happy first to invite Alison Paul, a senior US consulting principal in the retail and distribution business, and our leading Catalyst partner in the US, and probably the coolest partner you will ever meet at Deloitte. Alison, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Amit, and thank you, Ronnie, for that quick tour through our paper. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Good morning, good evening. We have some panelists who, well, actually, we're global. I think Chem is in New York, and we have a couple of panelists in Israel, and I'm talking to you very early in the morning from Los Angeles. So let's get right to it. As Amit said, I help lead our Catalyst US practice here at Deloitte, and really help connect the dots between big enterprise and sort of old school organizations and the startup network or ecosystem where many of you play and have incredibly innovative ideas and solutions that that all of us are trying to sort through. And as has been said, you know, the two most popular phrases over the last several months have been "you're on mute" and let's make lemonade out of lemons. And so I think these three panelists with me today will tell a little bit about not only the challenges of COVID and the pandemic and really the business that we are in today, but also what kinds of opportunities that this event has actually shown all of us. So I'm going to start by letting each of them introduce themselves fairly quickly here and talk a little bit about what they do, what their remit is, and then we'll get into a couple of questions. So Daniel, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Daniel Koren. I'm the director of e-commerce at Fiscal, which is Israel's largest retailer and also largest e-tailer. I've joined Fiscal a year and a half ago to set up a new unit, the e-commerce unit, after spending 10 years with McKinsey. Very eager to speak about e-commerce. I will just say that 10 years after McKinsey, I thought that the post-McKinsey life is going to be calmer and, in a way, duller. Neither. So it's way more, it's a roller coaster, and it's way, extremely exciting. So I'm really happy to talk about this, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Daniel. And yes, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. We had a nice conversation about how consulting's one way of your life being crazy, but retail is a whole other element. So Anna from PepsiCo, tell us a little bit about what you do at PepsiCo, Anna.
Hi, my name is Anna Fabrov, and I lead PepsiCo's partnership with cutting-edge startup technologies across our entire value chain, right? From the potato field all the way down to commercial. So by default, my role puts me in the forefront of innovation to help PepsiCo become faster, stronger, and better in implementing new technologies.
Excellent, thank you. And Chad?
Hey everyone, my name is Jem Kent. I'm currently entrepreneur in residence at Teammate, which is a New York, Tel Aviv-based venture capital group. I spent my whole career in technology startups, both on the investing side as well as on the operating side. And Teammate has a pretty unique approach to venture capital. So rather than just kind of matching investment capital to need, as most funds operate, it kind of builds companies from within. Partnering with founders to kind of lead that process. So I've been helping lead that process for one of Teammate's newest companies, focusing on the retail and consumer goods industry, specifically helping organizations leverage their data more effectively and impactfully. And so last 2 years, particularly the last 12 months, has been obviously very interesting to kind of be on the front lines and see how organizations are coping and how they're preparing themselves for the future. So really happy to be here.
Thank you, Jem. So let's start with Daniel with the retailer's perspective. Daniel, why don't you talk a little bit about how COVID, a little bit about what you've been doing, but how COVID impacted both the challenges that you have for brick and mortar and e-commerce, as well as some of the opportunities it presented for you and for your customers.
Yeah. So first, a couple of words about Trifleside. I think one thing that distinguishes Trifleside is that we have a really an impressive share of total sales, our online sales. We have more than 20%. This is, I think, a global leader. I haven't found any other example, at least. I'm talking about brick and mortar retailers. And in this aspect, many people, Israelis on the call might say that we want to be the local Amazon, but we actually want to be the local Walmart, right? Because we are a brick and mortar retailer with a brick and mortar brand, with a different kind of interaction with our clients, and this is where we want to transform and to build e-commerce and digital capabilities. And this is basically the reason why I joined Shufersal a year and a half ago. And yeah, what a year that has been. So it's like literally like, I don't know, 5 or 7 years in 1 year. So I basically joined mid 2019, and for me the main objective was to build e-commerce capabilities, knowing that so far Shufersal was dealing mostly with local competition, but about 2 years ago, local competition became a bit more sophisticated. We also had international competition, especially with Amazon coming to Israel with some big announcements. And then COVID hit. I remember very vividly, we were doing actually an online campaign on television, and we were saying, sales are, first week of the campaign, sales were okay. Second week of the campaign, sales were really impressive, and it really took off like crazy. So we basically grew almost overnight by 50%. And I think for a brick and mortar retailer or some physical operation that stand behind e-commerce, especially given that we have a relatively complex set of operation because our baskets are very big. We have 50, 60 items in the basket, and it's groceries, so the last mile is complicated, and there's a lot of food restrictions, etc. So scaling so quickly wasn't obvious. So we first experienced really high demand with some extreme shortage in capacity. Some of the Israelis on the call remember that we were having 2 weeks waiting time instead of usual same day, next day SLAs. And what we quickly had to do is to, as quickly as possible, try to remove any roadblocks from the operation. So, any help, any ease on the website, on every aspect that we could generate, and to basically increase capacity as fast as we could. At some point, we even went to do some, let's say, a bit more drastic moves, like, for example, removing the option to select substitute products, which is a very customer-oriented approach, but also very time-consuming in terms of the operation. I can talk about that also a bit later. And then we were always trying to balance, so obviously we didn't need to invest too much in marketing during this time, which was, just trying to manage the demand, but still, do we create some kind of barriers? Do we need to create some kind of limits? Do we let everybody come to the website? Because then the website crashes. So at some point we had to introduce several elements of balancing the load. Do we allow only existing customers to purchase, or do we also allow new customers that had different needs that did not exist, 2-3 weeks ago? They're now confined at home, and they also need to get our services, and our services are super important during a pandemic. So it was a really interesting time. We learned a lot. We learned about what's important for consumers, for customers. We learned that our customers' expectations did not go down. So at some point we thought, as long as we're providing something, bread and rice, they should be content. But no, our customers still had really high expectations. We were still selling non-grocery items, so obviously home stuff for like staying at home, like gaming and laptops and things like that. But also many, iPhone sales soared during the first lockdown because people did not spend money abroad on vacation. They had to, somehow spend it. So the fact that we're able, on one hand, to provide the most basic needs of, rice and sugar and toilet paper, obviously, that was a really big story. But on the same time, selling also iPhones and Dysons and gaming stuff was really interesting. And I think for me, eventually, the key takeaway that I'm taking is actually on our strategy, right? So we couldn't, there's a lot of really strong strategy people on this panel, and I think none of you could probably expect something like COVID, such a disruption. What I think we could expect, and we should continue expecting going forward, is to have the ability to respond, right? So if we build really strong capabilities, as flexible as possible, then we'll probably be able to handle better whatever next COVID is going to be, whatever next disruption is going to be. And this is really what we're trying to focus before and during COVID. Be as flexible as possible, try to respond as quickly as possible to the changes in the market, in consumer demand. Don't be afraid to try things, to fail. I can talk also about some mistakes that we've done. As long as we're doing things and moving forward, I think we'll eventually succeed.
So I love that, Daniel, that, you know, despite the fact that it was an unprecedented 100-year global pandemic, consumers still expected to get their full variety of products from you anytime, anywhere, right? And so we have a high bar as sellers and purveyors and suppliers, which really speaks to the point that in order to be able to meet those needs, we constantly have to be innovating and thinking about the future and thinking a step ahead of our customers. And so, Anna, I know you at PepsiCo, you own a big part of the innovation agenda. Can you talk a little bit about what your approach is with startups and innovation and how you think about it at PepsiCo to get ready for the next big event with a consumer?
Yeah, that's actually interesting. And Daniel, I can relate to a lot of the things you said, because obviously we faced similar challenges, but then on the manufacturer, on the CPG side, but we can touch that later. I think, so our approach towards startups and innovation in general, 3 years ago, we started to think kind of, how can PepsiCo become a bigger player? How can we bring that innovation and leverage that in-house? And this is why we've built PepsiCo Labs. So this is our bridge between the world of cutting edge startup technology and kind of PepsiCo needs, right? The world is changing so quickly. It changed quickly before COVID, and then COVID just enhanced whatever was happening. And then this unprecedented pace of motion is really driven by startup technology. I mean, they innovate faster than we big companies ever can innovate. So we've created this kind of PepsiCo Labs to effectively engage, partner, and then ultimately scale, right? Because the ultimate measure is how do you bring this technology in-house and fully embed it? And we do this with kind of 3 very simple steps. One is that we discover those startups that address specific business needs. So it's knowing what you need to solve and finding the right solution, right? That's kind of the first step. And then you test it in a real PepsiCo environment. And that can be on our trucks, this can be in our potato fields, this can be in our manufacturing side, marketing campaign, you name it, but in an actual environment. And then if the pilot is successful, you scale, which is, by the way, the hardest part, right? Because doing an isolated sandbox kind of pilot is one thing, but then really rolling this out, implementing across big companies. So kind of this is our, I guess, secret sauce, or this is what works for PepsiCo.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's really amazing to think of such a big company really trying to be super agile and innovative. And so if PepsiCo can figure out how to do it, certainly many other supplier companies can. So at the same time that this was all going on for suppliers and retailers, Teammate wasn't standing still. Like, the world did not stop around venture capital or around startups coming up with good ideas, Jem, right? So why don't you talk a little bit about what you saw during the pandemic, despite the fact that the whole world was grappling with this really unprecedented event?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a really unique kind of place within that entire innovation supply chain, right? We try to have a very front seat. You know, one of the really unique aspects of, I think, the Teammate kind of company building process is the kind of the network of corporate partners and relationships that it's fostered, so that we could really have open dialogue, really understand the challenges that a lot of these large organizations are facing, and ultimately become kind of partners in that ideation process. So it's obviously a very unique place, a unique seat to have. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, as one might expect, there was kind of this feeling of, hey, what's going to happen over the next couple of months? A lot of kind of urgent processes, obviously, a lot of partners kind of saying, hey, we're obviously still really invested in our kind of innovation timeline, but we need to take a step back here and make sure that we're really meeting our top priorities, making sure that we're bringing products to the shelf, right? These really kind of basic aspects and meeting that real rise in consumer demand. And I'm mainly talking about kind of fast moving consumer goods and kind of the grocery retail market specifically here. But I think what was really interesting for us to see, it was kind of how quickly a lot of partners and a lot of retailers and a lot of these large organizations like Anna's, for example, was able to kind of come back and say, we're still devoted to our innovation timeline, and how quickly they were able to kind of, you know, get back on track on that. And I think one of the things that we kind of witnessed was, I would say, a kind of a increase, I would say, in the overall confidence of being able to move a little bit more quickly. What we witnessed firsthand was a lot of timelines being expedited incredibly quickly, right? A lot of retailers that might have had a click and collect type of end-to-end program that they wanted to execute over the course of 2 years, expedited to a number of months. And I think that gave rise to a sense of, hey, we could actually get this done, and a confidence that we could actually expedite these timelines. And I think what I'm anticipating is that will kind of continue into the future and bode well ultimately for a lot of startups that want to service the industry as well.
And I heard the exact same thing, Jem. One of my retail clients actually has an outpost or a division in China. And they talked about the fact that they had a couple of different projects going on that they had really planned for them to take 6 months to a year to complete. And literally, as lockdown began, they completed them in a matter of weeks because they made them the priority and the focus, and they took all the other extraneous stuff off the desk. So that was a real accelerator. So Daniel, as you think about Shufersal and how you guys managed through the pandemic, you mentioned before you may have had a couple of things that you did that like didn't work out so well, and probably got some learning out of that. And I'm seeing some questions about specific innovations. Perhaps you can talk about something that you tried that you figured out, this didn't work quite the way we expected it to, and what you learned from that.
Yeah, so I think there are a few examples. I'll pick a couple of them. One, I think at some point, because we wanted to increase capacity as much as we could on the operational side, we actually reduced certain elements of the process and basically degraded some operational processes, which all came in the thought that we can probably reduce SLAs. For example, you know, we can be a bit later, or we don't need to necessarily pick all the products, etc. And consumers will be, you know, satisfied enough. But what happened, I think, is two things. One, as I said before, the consumer expectations are still super high. And second, I think at some point we kind of lost control a little bit about some of the operational processes. So I think even, you know, I come from the Navy, right? So a strong knot of a boat would probably hold also during a crazy storm. So during the storm is where you really need to go back to the basic processes and the things that you used to do all the time, and not basically release everything and then let be blown away. So I think this is one lesson. The second is, as I said before, we were facing extreme demand. So 2.5 weeks of waiting time and lead time for the next deliveries. It was, you know, it was even kind of a joke, even on TVs, etc. Everybody was celebrating when the Shufersal van was coming, but we understood we had a problem, right? And we had to give something else to our consumers. So what we decided is actually to go for a totally different concept. We called it the fast basket. So we usually have about 12,000 SKUs, so a very big variety and a very big assortment of multi-categories, multi-brands, etc. But we selected, you know, the most important 150 SKUs. So one type of rice, one type of pasta, one type of milk, etc., etc. And we created a whole new operating model, a whole new website, really a whole new distribution network. And we call it the fast basket, right? Because the promise was you order that, okay, so you compromise a little bit on the assortment, but you get it same day, next day. And we were sure that this is going to go through the roof, and it did not, right? So basically what happened, there was a bit of a question of a timing, right? So we did it really fast. We set everything up in about 10 days, including the website, selecting the products, creating the physical facilities where everything was picked. But those 10 days really, the pandemic was going really quickly. So those 10 days took us from the peak of the pandemic to a slight decrease in going into the Jewish holidays. So we just basically saw lower demand. And second, as I said before, consumers want to get it today or tomorrow, but they want the full spectrum. They want the full assortment. They don't want to order the 150 items. So I'm taking a few good things out of that, right? The trial and error, do it really, really fast. And we even had worked on that on an increased assortment of several hundreds, which I think would fit better a future lockdown, which did not come at the same level as the first one, but we were better ready for that afterwards. But I think really the ability of the entire organization working towards a goal and setting everything up in a week is something that will serve us in the future.
For sure, a lot of great learnings there. So Anna, let me ask you, as you think about innovators, and a lot of the folks on the phone here are founders and startups, how do you think about them approaching organizations like yourselves and retailers and talking about their innovation, and what kind of advice might you give them as you think about what they do and how they express the benefits of what their innovation is?
That's a great question. So speaking through the lens of a large corporate, which has a unique language, usually large corporates tend to have, live in a universe of their own, right? So I can tell you some startups are very good at pitching. They're doing a great job at presenting their product, and some do a very, very poor job. Now, this is driven by various things, but I think if I need to flag out one, it's lack of preparation. And I can give a few examples. So one, not preparing for your audience, right? Not knowing how deep to go on the technological elements or how high level to be. And it depends if you're talking to the CTO or if you're talking to somebody who's really in the weeds, right? Or not preparing for the specific use case that is relevant for your audience and for that specific company. Because, and today a lot of technologies can apply to multiple verticals. But if you're talking to a company that's focusing on supply chain, it's not the same use case as with an energy company, right? Although your product might provide the same benefit to them. And then also understanding, and even taking the time to understand the decision-making process in the corporate world in general and in that organization specifically, because it's different, right? Because startups, tend to think we can take a decision on the spot. Everybody's the founder. Everybody's taking decisions. Corporates, it's not. You have different considerations of geographies, of budget years, of hierarchies. So just take some time. It's not hard to learn, right? You can get that data. You just need to invest the time in really doing a lot of preparation. And obviously there's a cultural difference which can be learned, right? So Israeli startups tend to come with their kind of very open approach, which works for a lot of things, but it doesn't work in a few very specific things, right? When you need to be a bit more subtle in your pitch.
So Anna, that's some great advice. And one of the things that is in the report that all of you will see if you haven't seen it yet is there's a bunch of great use cases that talk about how the actual startup solves the problem. And to your point, Anna, just because it solves it for a CPG company doesn't mean it doesn't solve it for some other industry, because a lot of these things can be repurposed across industries. So I'm going to give Daniel, our retailer, the last word. Daniel, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the same question, how innovators approach retailers, what kinds of things you look for, what kind of advice can you give them, and then we will wrap and go to Ira.
Yeah. So yeah, the world of e-commerce across all the different functions from marketing to operation to logistics, etc. There's tons of potential innovation. There's a lot of data. It's relatively new processes, and it's almost endless optimization problems. I would say almost every part of the value chain can basically be optimized by using data and using innovation. But then there are different flavors, I think, and one of the advices that I would give also to relating to what Anna said about the decision process depends a little bit who is the basically the stakeholder in charge of that specific part of the value chain. So for example, I'll give you two examples from our side. So we have invested in new automated warehouse, and we have invested 150 million euros into those warehouses. this is where we need to be super accurate, and there's no really room for mistake, right? If we are about to launch those centers in a month, I think one of my colleagues leading that is also here on the call, and I'm sure it's going to be an amazing experience. But we had to make sure as a company it will be an amazing experience, right? We didn't really have the opportunity or the ability to fail or to build something and then completely rebuild it. So there we had to come with much more a rigorous approach, you know, completely proven. On the other hand, you know, I'm doing a lot of the marketing, email marketing, different campaigns, etc. This is where we can go really wild, right? So we can test many different things. Really, the cost of error is relatively small, and I would say, you know, as a stakeholder as I am, I would really appreciate startups that don't necessarily come with the right solution, but allow me to test and experiment as quickly as possible, and through that get to the optimal solution, right? So a much faster, much more agile approach, taking also into consideration, you know, things like IT integration, which is always complex, especially in an organization like us. So in some cases, get as quickly as possible. And it's also a little bit relating to what Anna said about the decision process, right? So in some cases, the big decision process is up front. When you invest 150 million euros, big decision up front. Some cases, you know, the first decision to implement some quick freemium service into our operation is relatively a small error. It's not a really significant decision. So let's do that. Let's show that we have, you know, a quick proof of concept, show the value, and then talk about scaling it, right? So it really changes where the balance of the decision is and who are the decision makers. So I would say, you know, as a startup, know your audience, who your stakeholder is, what's important for him, what's the culture, the internal culture from which he comes within the company, and try to adapt to that.
Thank you, Daniel. Those are very wise words. And I would just emphasize that if you are approaching a retailer or a CPG firm or any large corporate, really understanding that corporate's problem as well as you understand your own technology is where the starting point that you want to be at, because you want to solve their problem, not just sell your technology. If your technology solves it, that's great, but really empathize and understand. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Amit. Thank you, panelists, so much for joining us today. It was wonderful to have you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alison. Really insightful. And we're moving directly to our last speaker of the day. Ira Kalish is Deloitte's Chief Global Economist and probably the smartest guy in Deloitte. And Ira will share with us the global economic outlook age of COVID-19. And Ira, try to keep it a bit more optimistic than usual.
Okay, well, having called me the smartest guy in Deloitte, you've raised expectations to an unrealistic level. I always say the best thing you can do when giving a presentation is set expectations low, and then people will be happily surprised. But in any event, thank you for having me today. I'll talk for a little bit about what I see going on in the world and where I think we're going to wind up after the pandemic, and then I'll be happy to take questions. Over the course of the past year, what we've learned is that the most important thing in terms of economic performance in any country has been control of the virus. What we've learned is that anytime there's been a surge in the outbreak, even in the absence of lockdowns by governments, there's been a deceleration or decline in economic activity. And the reason is that at least a sufficient number of people get scared of the virus, stay home, avoid social interaction, and avoid spending money in ways that have a negative impact on economic activity. And we've seen that over and over in the course of the past year. And that will continue to be the case, but the good news, of course, now is that there is a vaccine, several, and that is evidently helping to suppress the virus and setting the stage for herd immunity and a very robust economic recovery. We know from the experience of Israel, of course, which is the one country that's vaccinated the most people on a per capita basis, that this has led to a very sharp drop in the number of infections and should serve the Israeli economy very well in the coming year, especially those parts of the economy that have been most disrupted by the virus. And during the course of the past year, in multiple countries around the world, what has tended to happen is that when we have had outbreaks of the virus, the parts of the economy that have suffered the most involve consumer spending on services, because that entails social interaction. So we've seen consumers avoid restaurants, bars, movie theaters, retail stores, airplanes, hotels, and the like. On the other hand, what we have seen also is consumers, at least those who have a steady income and rising wealth, continue to spend vigorously on products for the home, on durable goods, on electronics, on home home improvement products, on furniture. Here in the United States, we had sort of a bifurcated economy over the past year where consumer spending on services dropped precipitously. But after the initial shock of the virus, and then the initial recovery involved very strong consumer spending on durable goods, on some non-durable goods like groceries, but not apparel, because people weren't going anywhere, so they basically didn't care how they looked. We saw people moving because they decided it's likely that they would be working at home for a long period of time, if not forever. So here in the US, a lot of people left their urban condos and bought bigger houses in the suburbs and rural areas. And the housing market was and has been essentially on fire. And that had a positive spillover effect on that part of the retail sector that involved things for the home. And the fact that people and businesses continued to do a lot of remote interaction in the midst of the pandemic had a huge positive impact on consumer spending on electronics, as well as on business spending on online equipment. On the other hand, business spending on structures like office buildings and shopping centers did very poorly. So that's sort of the bifurcated economy in which we existed during this pandemic. So where do we go from here? Right now in the United States, we're seeing very robust recovery take place, in part because the number of infections of the virus have dropped sharply following a change in behavior on the part of consumers and following a bigger than expected number of vaccinations taking place. And on top of that, we had in December a modest fiscal stimulus, and there's an expectation, a strong one, that will have an even bigger fiscal stimulus later this month. And so consumers have been spending heavily. It's interesting that the stimulus we had in December, it was $900 billion, which I called modest. I don't think I've ever called $900 billion a modest number before, but it was modest. And it involved a large amount of money handed to American consumers. The evidence suggests they saved about 80% of that money. But the 20% that they spent was significant and significantly boosted the retail industry here in the US. The interesting thing is that the money they saved is now sitting in the bank. And over the course of the coming year, once we achieve herd immunity, perhaps by the summer, when a large enough share of the population will have been vaccinated, many of those consumers will feel comfortable going back out again and spending on consumer-facing services. And they will have plenty of money in the bank to spend. And so the fact that the stimulus wasn't spent initially still sets the stage for very robust growth later this year, both here in the US, and I think we'll see the same thing happen in Western Europe. In Asia, we've already seen very strong growth in China, although the Chinese economy has lately decelerated for a variety of reasons. But the good thing in East Asia is that they never really had, following the first quarter of last year, a very substantial outbreak of the virus. They did a much better job than the West in terms of suppressing the virus often through a very intrusive regime of testing, tracing, and quarantining. Interestingly, though, they've been very slow to get the vaccine distributed. So I think we're going to have globally a pretty good year this year because of the distribution of the vaccine, especially because of the massive fiscal stimulus that we're going to have in the US, which in part will drain out to the rest of the world as Americans increase their imports substantially. And in terms of the retail industry, it will be very positive. I think we'll continue to have strong spending on consumer goods that we've already seen. But also, as the virus starts to disappear, people will start to spend money on those goods that they've avoided, like clothing, and on those services that they've avoided, like restaurants and travel and out-of-home entertainment. On the other hand, I think some of the changes that we've seen during this pandemic will persist and will have significant effects on business and especially on retailing. During the pandemic, we've seen a sharp shift toward working remotely. And while I think people will go back to the office to some extent, they won't go back completely. Just based anecdotally on the conversations I've had with many of our clients, both here in the US as well as in Europe, I think a large number of workers will continue to work remotely at least part of the time. And that will have very broad implications. That will mean less traffic on the road, less demand for energy and lower energy prices, less demand for office space, and maybe some stress in the financial markets that have supported commercial property mortgages. It could have either a positive or negative impact on worker productivity. I think there's a positive impact from greater use of online technology, but maybe a negative impact if we never get together in person and have those informal moments where we exchange ideas that lead to innovation and productivity gains. So I think ideally, we'll have to have a mix of working remotely, but still getting together occasionally. And in terms of retail, during this pandemic, we've seen a sharp shift toward online shopping. And I think that will persist. It's interesting, in China, for example, there, online retail sales accounted for 4% of the total in 2019, but 25% of the total in 2020. That's a shocking change. And I don't think it will necessarily stay at 25% this year, but it's not going back to 4%. So that will mean in China, in the US, in Western Europe, probably in Israel, a large number of retail stores will be redundant. And a large number of shopping centers will have to shift toward multiple uses other than shopping. We will have more exchange of bits and bytes. We will have more employment in distribution centers and data warehouses and transportation services, and less employment in retail stores. Here in the US, the retail industry has traditionally been the largest employer, especially of low-skill, low-wage people. And many of those people will permanently lose their jobs, as will other low-wage, low-skill people in other consumer-facing services. And that will reinforce what we've already seen over the last 20 years of growing income disparity and a decline in labor force participation on the part of people with lower levels of skill. And that will be a significant problem for the global economy. And the best solution to that, in my view, will be more government spending on retraining and just simply on an investment in human capital, so that we can have a labor force that has the skills needed for the kinds of jobs that will be created. I think we'll have more online meetings like this. Now, for my part, I'm itching to get back on an airplane. I used to travel an awful lot, as Allison can attest, and so did she. And I think we both will travel again, but probably not as much as we did in the past, and that will be a shock to the airline, hotel, and related industries. Tourists will still travel. I think Israel will still be a major destination for tourists, but the reality is a very large share of travel has been business travel, and that will decline, and that will have a negative impact on the travel industry as well as on the store-based retail industry. And finally, I think one of the things we've seen in this pandemic was substantial disruption of supply chains. It began in the first quarter of last year with China shutting down, and we suddenly recognized that global supply chains were effectively Chinese supply chains, and many industries were severely disrupted. And then we saw that disruption shift to Europe and the US, and we saw it persist even after economies reopened because of the need to enforce social distancing and the need for factories and distribution centers to operate below capacity. And we also saw a dramatic shift in consumer and business spending patterns, which disrupted factories and warehouses because companies were not selling the things that suddenly people wanted. And then we also continue to see disruption of the transportation of traded goods. There aren't yet enough container ships back operating fully. A lot of small, high-value merchandise is shipped in the underbelly of passenger airplanes, and a lot of them are not flying. So there's a shortage of capacity to ship traded goods, and that's already creating price increases. We've seen shortages of components and inputs and commodities. Right now, there's a severe global shortage of semiconductor chips, in part because there's been a huge increase in the demand for online technologies. And at the same time, the automotive industry is increasingly a technology industry. Cars are basically computers. And now the automotive companies have a shortage of chips. And many automotive factories around the world have had to shut down because they don't have the chips needed to produce the number of cars that are being produced. So I think some of this disruption will persist for a while, although it will ultimately work its way through and will sort of get back to normal. So what are some of the other big issues going forward? One issue is, will we have higher inflation? There's a lot of concern right now here in the US that with a substantial fiscal stimulus coming, that is probably bigger than the gap between actual and potential GDP. We could have an overheated economy, and that's in the context of an already aggressive and easy monetary policy. So there are some people arguing that we're at substantial risk of much higher inflation with the possibility of a wage price spiral. And of course, historically, inflation has been good for retailers. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s when we had ruinous inflation, and retailers didn't have to worry that much about just-in-time inventory management. They made money on inventories. They didn't have to be that efficient. Consumers were not that price sensitive because in an inflationary environment, it was more difficult for them to discern price differences. So in that sense, an inflationary environment might actually be a good thing. So are we going to get that? Sadly, my view is probably not. I think we'll probably get a temporary surge in inflation, but I think it will likely go away. I don't think we're going to see the kind of wage price spiral that we did in the past. There's still a lot of slack in global labor markets, and there's still the possibility that central banks can reverse policy and fight a rise in inflation expectations. So I think we're going to go back to low inflation, low borrowing costs, low cost of capital. And I believe I'm running out of time. So I'm going to stop there, Allison, and I'm happy to take questions.
So unfortunately, so there was one question on inflation, and Ira, thank you for answering that. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. So if there's any additional questions for Ira, please send them to us and we'll make sure that Ira gets them. And thank you, Ira, again, for a great overview. And this brings us to the end of our event. And I'd like to thank again all the speakers, panelists, and of course, you, the participants. We encourage you to reach out and continue conversation with us. Goodbye and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.